Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner. Chapter 17. Fleeting Haven. Packages burst open, disgorging their contents as they hit the ground. Most of the discarded baggage was food, but anything that did not hold significant value or could not be replaced was being purged from Edek's bags. Out of all of them, the Drake seemed the least affected by the news that an army was marshalling directly outside Heldor. He nonchalantly scooped up any of the fallen morsels of food he found appealing as Fletch hastily lightened him. "That's the last of it," Fletch said, hopping down from Edek's side. "You should be able to run properly now."
"Who do you think they are?"
Fate asked. She sat crouched on her haunches, studying the moving mass of the army far in the distance. Its presence may have been fading from sight in the oncoming darkness, but it grew ever more enigmatic. "I don't care to guess," Fletch said quickly. He tightened the straps of Edek's harness so that the now lightly held bags would not shake or flop around. "I can't make out any banners at this distance, but their trajectory is clear. They're making for the city, and we must outpace them." At that, the fox slapped Edek's side and would have dashed away at once if not for Felix's nervous cry. "Have you lost your wits?" the prince argued. "You're willingly going into a city that's about to be attacked." Fletch pulled up short and looked at Felix. "We don't know that for certain," he said. "We don't know who they are, or what they plan for Heldor. It may be we have to help protect the innocents of that city, but the three of us can't do it alone." Fate had gotten to her feet now and was securing her longbow around her shoulders, preparing to run. She looked tense, but purposeful.
"We're Lightbearers, Felix. Our place is to protect the Lightkeepers, and the best way to do that is to get into the city and get to that stronghold. We'll have to organize with the others at the temple."
Prince Felix was looking hesitantly between the aforementioned city, clearly in danger from a considerable force of armed militants, and the two Lightbearers, who, at the moment, seemed to have taken leave of their better senses. He was about to open his mouth to argue the utter insanity of rushing into a city besieged, when Edek spoke.
"We do not force you to come with us,"
Edek said in his deep rumble. The Drake's voice was not cold or chastising, as it so often was when directed at Felix. Instead, it resounded with a sense of duty and honor.
"A path must be chosen."
Fletch straightened proudly. "And this is the path we go," he said. "Farewell, Prince of Landor." The fox then took off into the countryside at a sprint, holding tight to the scabbard of Swan so that it would not get tangled in his feet. Edek followed without a moment's hesitation. Only Fate stood watching the prince for a few sacred heartbeats.
"Take care of yourself, Felix,"
Fate said softly. Then she, too, bounded down the path. Prince Felix stood rooted to the spot. He looked between the advancing forces of the unknown army and then to the retreating forms of the Lightbearers harrowing towards the same city. He had become quite fond of them, and seeing them run towards danger upset him greatly. He ran his thumb across the jewel of the Crimson Catalyst, which he wore more out of habit than usefulness, at least until they figured out why it did not act the way a lithium crystal should. Felix still had so many questions, and the answers seemed to lay close at hand, but at a terrible risk. The city might be an imminent threat, but internally a fight was already raging inside the prince. His brain and instincts told him it was incredibly foolish to follow them, that he should run, flee, find somewhere safe to hide, and wait out the calamity. But something else urged him differently, onward, toward danger. He looked at the twinkling city. There at the far side, next to the sea, he could see the Lightkeeper Temple. Its ivory spires stabbed the skyline just like the spears that advanced upon it, and the shining gold reflected the same burnished light of the failing day. Felix took one slow step forward, and then he was running, chasing down the path made by the Lightbearers before him, chasing after the thing his heart told him was right. The countryside that lay between the company and the city was still a considerable distance. As they traversed those desperate miles, Fate noticed that Prince Felix was following, and she quickly made it known to Fletch. The fox checked his stride slightly until the prince had caught them up. Then he carried onward as if the very hounds of the fury were at their flanks. They took the grasslands at a breakneck pace, and many unexpected challenges waylaid them. They dodged rocks and jumped streams, traversed logs and pushed aside brush, struggled up hills and fell down grassy ravines, but one thing remained constant. They ran. Finally, at the crest of a hill, Fletch halted. All of them were heavily winded. The fox drank quickly of a water skin and passed it to Fate. She tried to drink, but could barely get any liquid down her throat between rapid breaths, and after only a sip, she passed the skin on to Felix. The prince was the worst of the lot. He drank, but vomited back up the water almost as soon as it had passed his lips. He was doubled over, both paws holding onto his knees, coughing, spluttering, and gasping for air. Fate felt concern for him, but her pity was quickly driven out by a manifested stitch in her side, which stabbed at her like a knife. Fletch checked their surroundings, and Fate could tell he was trying to judge the position of the army in relation to their hill. However, the miles upon which they had so rapidly covered now clouded the ominous haze that bore down on the city, obscured by the sheer breadth of Heldor. Fletch had brought them upon the city from the south and west, and the army, as best he could reckon, had been making for the northern gate. The Lightkeeper Temple lay at the easternmost point of the city, which butt right out against the ocean on a small peninsula of land. That by itself should afford them some manner of leeway, as even the most determined of assailants would first need to make their way through the many curving streets of the main district before they would be able to reach the Lightkeeper Temple. The city of Heldor, despite its splendor, had no real defensible positions, such as thick walls or the like of portcullis gates, which one might observe in the capital. Mostly because it had never had need of such things. For as long as memory could recall, Heldor had served as a hub by which all nations had found a mutual benefit. None had dared disturb the free trade and profitability that came with having a truly neutral hub from which to operate. Beside the obvious profits that came from the neutral standing of Heldor, it had long ago been chosen by the Lightbearers as one of their key cities, and it housed the largest temple of the Keeper on the Landoran continent. The mere presence of so many Lightbearers coming and going from the city at any one time had deterred most notions of violence into non-being. This particular arrangement had made the city a natural mecca for business, and it had flourished from a once quaint port town on the edge of the broken shores to the sprawling labyrinth that it was today. Governed loosely by a mayor who kept the basic needs of the inhabitants happy, but also who held no alliance to any particular nation. The city had flourished under these conditions, becoming a veritable hub of innovation as the many different skills and trades from various nations met and competed for profits. By collecting an impartial fee from any who did business within the city, the operational needs of the city were met, with such things as city guards being funded and employed by Heldor directly. The city guards employed by Heldor may have been stout protectors, but they were little more than a deterrent to keep cutpurses off the streets, or rambunctious sailors from burning down the seaside pubs with drunken shenanigans. If any larger trouble reared its head within the city, usually the Lightbearers were already involved, and the problem seemed to get resolved without any help from the city guards. Needless to say, the city guards of Heldor were by no means a fighting force, compared to organized troops, and thus incapable of repelling a direct assault. "Come on," Fletch said, breathing heavily as he pulled Felix up by the collar. He took a few jogging steps forward, but he looked tired and footsore. "We need to cross the city. With any luck, we will have beaten them here, and we can get into the temple unchecked." They were on the outskirts of the city properly now, and although Fletch urged them on, none could do better than a hobble or a wobble. They willed their tired feet and aching legs to obey as they passed between a few scattered residences and labored onward towards the seaside of the city. This part of Heldor was comprised mostly of private residences, small, squat little villas, whitewashed and at home against the salt spray of the nearby sea. It was quiet and sleepy compared to the busy and bustling trade district north of them, which held an impressive array of establishments set betwixt twisting roads that catered to any need and rightly garnered the title as Heart of the City most adequately. Set amongst the silent residences, and as if by obstinate design, the Lightkeeper Temple shone out most prominently. A colossal conglomeration of white ivory pinnacles reaching skyward, contrasted by beautiful and slender archways of dark steel connecting one elegant tower to the next. By some trick of innovation, or perhaps a little-known lightcraft technique, the temple was clearly visible in the gathering darkness, for its exterior was lit by an even white glow, and from behind tall crystalline windows set deeply into white walls radiated outward a soft, golden light. Thus the Temple of the Keeper shone like a beacon lighthouse from amongst the dark waves that surrounded the tiny peninsula upon which it sat. The company hurried past residence after residence, each of which became gradually more seaworthy as they approached the coast, and made for the shining Lightkeeper Temple in the distance. There was still perhaps a mile of city set between them and the safe haven that was the temple gates. Fate's anxiety increased with every step, but at the same time she was ultimately glad for the relative seclusion of the temple, even though it meant they had to travel the whole length of Heldor to get there. The temple's remote location had been chosen from this part of the city because it offered a means by which Lightbearers could come and go as they pleased without disturbing the city's hub. The cluttered, tight, curving streets, the herd of obnoxious peddlers, the veritable mounds of general persons which dominated the business district, would normally make for ideal conditions in which a few weary wanderers would go by virtually unnoticed. However, they were the exception and would certainly have been marked. Edek would have undoubtedly drawn a wondrous spectacle of onlookers, if not set in motion a downright commotion. The presence of a drake in a more inhabited section of the city was not a good idea. But as it stood, this part of the city remained still and quiet in the lazy hours of twilight, and they did not meet any resistance. The Lightkeeper Temple loomed ever larger with each step. It seemed their relentless pace set from the outskirts of town had paid off, and they had indeed outpaced the encroaching army. They would reach the temple and give warning. Then they would offer whatever assistance they could.
"Felix?"
Fate panted, finding her voice. Her racing heart had allowed nothing other than shallow, rapid breathing to take place for the last few minutes.
"Once we get into the temple, you'll need to show the crimson—"
Galong! A loud klaxon sound echoed throughout the city, which drowned out Fate. It was followed by a deep humming. Fate clutched her head and ears tightly as the sound rang out again, pulsing through the city and vibrating the walls of the nearby buildings with the force of a gale. Fletch held tightly to one of his ears with a paw, but in his other was his sword Swan, naked and poised. He turned from side to side, his face screwed up against the noise, looking for a threat. The sound continued to assault the city, and with each blast, the humming became greater until the very ground began to shake. A dull vibration at first, and then an unbalancing torment. A pale golden light slowly emanated through the darkened alleyways. A final klaxon blast trumpeted, and then a great rumbling sound came, like 1,000 stones being cast over a precipice into a gorge. The trembling ground became a veritable earthquake, and then, as if it had never been, the earth became still. Distant screams went up, panicked voices carried on the wind, rife with terror of the unknown. However, the screams did not come from the direction the army was expected to land. Instead, it came from the direction of the Lightkeeper Temple. The pale golden light swelled, intensifying to a painful aura which made all shield their eyes. Then, to the utter bewilderment of Fletch, Fate, Felix, and Edek, they finally saw what was causing all the commotion. The Temple of the Keeper, wrapped in a spectral golden light, was lifting slowly away from the earth.
The temple?
Felix stammered in utter astonishment, his eyes wide in disbelief.
It's flying.
No, Fletch said, equally taken aback. His dark brown eyes tracked the temple as it ascended into the dusky sky.
It's a sky vessel.
The Temple of the Keeper was no building at all, but a sky vessel of enormous size. Not the whole temple, but a sizable portion of the upper spires, bridges, and catwalks seemed to have been shifted by great gears and hidden machinations, directed to move by the will of an immense power. Wrapped in a golden glow, this upper portion of the Temple of the Keeper had broken free from the ground and was slowly ascending upwards, casting a shimmering light across the coastal waves. Fate had seen breeze skimmers before, innovative little creations that used lightcraft technique to help power a flying mechanism attached to a small seafaring vessel. They had been part of Heldor culture for a long time. She had always assumed the machines were sensitive to the light somehow, and she could vaguely understand the mechanics of how they worked. Fate knew that the Lightbearers had been involved with the creation of the breeze skimmers. Some Lightbearers who had set their wandering days aside were fascinated with traditional alchemy. Naturally, such curiosities eventually led them to test lightcraft techniques against the craft, and it had yielded interesting results. But it had never been a topic that Fate found interesting enough to study for herself. If she had to guess at a method, she'd say, the air about the ship must be infused somehow. That, in tandem with the clever use of traditional ballast, is what allowed the small vessels the ability of flight. Wisely, anyone who tinkered with the rather finicky sky vessels usually kept to the broken shores. After all, if one were to fail, it was better to land safely back in the ocean than crash into the unyielding land. However, the sheer scope of the sky vessel that now slowly moved away from her and the others beggared belief. It was on a size and scale Fate had never believed possible, and the pure power required to lift something that big would only be achievable by a lightkeeper employing a massive amount of light. However, it wasn't the issue of how the feat was achieved that bothered Fate, but more importantly, the question of why burned in her mind. Why had the Lightkeeper, and Fate was sure only a keeper could have enacted such a display of power, turned to such drastic measures? It was true, the Lightkeepers and Lightbearers had come under pressure in the last few years. Vladimir's outcasters had seen to that growing bad reputation, and they struck fear in the minds of many. But for the most part, Lightbearers were still respected and represented a pillar of security, even though their ranks had waned heavily. The circumstances must be terrible indeed to give the temple's Lightkeeper cause to flee, and with that awful thought, Fate's fear of the oncoming army increased drastically. Their safe haven was gone, or to be more accurate, it had left without them, and now they too would have to run. If the Lightkeeper had vacated the city, a true doom must have fallen upon Heldor, and Fate and the others would not be able to stop it. Fate looked desperately at Fletch, searching his face for answers to the unasked question, "What do we do now?" Fletch had a perturbed look. He slowly sheathed Swan, but his frustrated scowl only deepened when he saw fate looking to him. It seemed that flying castles in the sky had temporarily robbed him of any clever solutions. He was at a very rare loss, and it was clear he was not pleased about it. Fate realized just then how much she had come to rely upon him when an unforeseen problem arose.
That is most peculiar.
Edek's low rumble split the tense silence. He was, like many others, watching the massive sky vessel slowly gain altitude.
Peculiar? Peculiar?
Fate's voice was high and strained with fear.
What are we supposed to do? We can't stay here and be cornered. For all of Fletch's talk about that army's motives, I've never known an army to assemble with peaceful notions being a forethought. We have no fallback position, no protection. The greatest army in the world would break against a guarded temple full of Lightbearers. But if you didn't notice, it just took off.
Fate pressed the palms of her paws deep into her eye sockets, trying desperately to waylay tears and gain a hold on her temper.
We could follow them,
said a small voice. Fate looked up. Prince Felix was not watching the temple, but was looking downward with a calculating look on his face. The small suggestion had been his.
How are we to do that exactly?
Fletch asked through gritted teeth.
We don't exactly have any spare falcons on hand.
He looked up at the sky vessel, performing a slow banking maneuver, all the while gaining altitude.
That thing looks like it's headed towards open water. The broken shores are called so for a reason. It could land anywhere.
The fox laughed suddenly.
Or never, for that matter. I've never seen anything like it before. I could get us out of the city, sure, but I doubt we could track it for long if it took to the open sea. No, you misunderstand me. We should follow it.
There was a very odd twinkle in Felix's eye as he elaborated his plan.
You've lost your mind,
was Fate's first reply, followed quickly by,
You're telling us you think you can actually fly one of those contraptions?
Well, Felix's voice was hesitant, but slightly defiant.
Yes, if we could get the mechanism started, I think I could fly one.
How? Fletch demanded.
By my reckoning, you had very little time with the Lightbearers before your... He searched for the right word, eventually landing on sequestered internment in Wellbarrow.
You forget, Felix said simply. I'm royalty.
And what does that have to do with it?
Fate asked in a somewhat more scathing tone than she intended. Prince Felix seemed not to notice Fate's rudeness, and instead took a large breath and launched into an explanation.
When I was young, my father was very friendly with the Lightkeeper Temple in Heldor. To broker better diplomatic relations with the temple, he allowed the city to become a free port. But he always delighted in the Lightbearers and their craft, so he would visit the city and bring me along.
Felix paced a little on the spot, recollecting old memories.
One of his favorite things to do was ride on the breeze skimmers.
A small smile broke across his face.
He thought sky vessels were something truly magical, right out of a story of legend. A mechanical Drakion, he called them.
Edek's eyes flashed at those particular words. Felix continued.
There was a Lightbearer.
He clicked his fingers together a few times, reaching for a name.
Caspian. Caspian?
Fate said, now intrigued.
Caspian was at the forefront of breeze skimmer craft. That was well before Fletch or I joined, though.
That's right, Felix intoned excitedly. Master Caspian would show us all the new ships, and whatever new oddities they were tinkering with. He used to elaborate extensively on what he hoped the craft would become in the future. On a few of the visits, he got extremely excited about their advancement, and insisted he take us out in one of the prototypes to show us how they worked. Nothing dangerous, mind you. Usually just small plunges into the air, like a stone skipping across the water. But... Felix became very excited.
Clearly, his work has advanced into something quite incredible now. Yes, they can sustain flight now, Fate confirmed, assuming you're crazy enough to try it. But still, that doesn't answer the question. He would let me ride along with him, at the helm, Felix interjected quickly. I was smaller then, and I would sit in his lap. Vlad never liked it. It made him queasy. So I had the captain all to myself, so to speak. And you remember what he did to make the ships fly? Fletch asked skeptically. Well, they weren't all that sophisticated, to be honest, Felix admitted. I won't lie to you and say I know exactly how they do what they do, but the controls at the helm were rather simple and crude. Looking back now, it was probably much more dangerous than we ever imagined, but my father loved it. Felix laughed slightly. Just think about it. A crash could have easily ended half the royal family in one fell swoop. I guess Vlad would have been king a lot sooner if that had happened. Fate looked worried. Oh, I really don't know about this. Felix looked slightly crestfallen at the lack of trust.
You should not look down on conviction so readily. If the boy believes he can do it, then he should be given the chance.
Edek looked regal as he said it. There was a golden fire in his large eye, enriched from the ambient light given off from the departing temple high above. Fate was totally flabbergasted at this sudden endorsement from the Drake. She looked from him to Felix, who looked equally stunned by the unexpected praise. Slowly, she turned to Fletch. I can get us to the docks well enough, Fletch said with raised eyebrows. He had an all-too-familiar grin upon his face. Now that the fox had a goal, no matter how seemingly unattainable or crazy, he would do all in his power to make it happen. Not without hesitation, and not without a terrible sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Fate eventually nodded her agreement. The docks of Heldor were split between two distinct ports. To the north of the peninsula, where the Temple of the Keeper sat, or used to sit, lay the industrial ports, a well-managed hub that brought goods directly into the main of the city. The second port was smaller and arranged along the southern part of the peninsula, where a curve of the land made a simple K and offered a natural protection from the sea storms that sometimes assaulted the coast. This more secluded southern port was arranged for the use of traditional residential craft, as well as the docks chosen to house any sky vessels. Here the more industrious Lightbearers advanced their skycraft technique, as some had come to call it, in jest after the manner of lightcraft techniques. The mast of many sleepy ships lay at harbor, their rigging swaying softly in the night breeze, with the occasional groan of ropes against their tackle as they pulled and strained with the gentle motion of the sea swell. The port is closed after dark, Fletch whispered to the night. This far out from the city, it's likely they haven't caught wind of what's going on yet. That gives us a very small advantage. Fletch led them quickly past the silent rigged sentinels bobbing in the water, looking for the one distinguishing feature which held a sky vessel above the rest of his waterbound kin. Although, if I'm wrong, I don't imagine I'll get to tell you I told you so. The docks were not overly full of vessels, and seeing as how they needed a very special one, it easily discounted most. After a bit of searching, the Fox stopped at the end of a long pier that led out to a singular vessel moored at the end, and by a stroke of good luck, it seemed large enough to take Edek's large bulk. The breeze skimmer was immediately recognizable by its lack of a mast. Instead, it had a distinct ballast that hung above the entirety of the ship's deck, a massive fabric structure, inflated and bulbous, that was tethered to the ship below with all manner of rigging. The fabric ballast reminded Fate of the paper lanterns that were sometimes let off during celebration times, that held a small candle, and would dance in the air long after they had been released upon the wind. However, to her knowledge, sky vessels had no flames, and it would be foolish to assume that fire would be powerful enough to lift an entire ship anyhow. No, whatever made these contraptions fly was associated with lightcraft technique. And now that she was facing the dilemma of relying on one of the vessels, she really wished she had spent a little more time in the temple's library honing her wider knowledge of the various lightcraft disciplines. Felix, seeing the breeze skimmer, started forward, eager to prove his merit. Fletch grabbed him by the jacket and hauled him down into a crouch. "Wait, look there," Fletch said, quickly pointing to a small flicker of light. Fate silently joined them, kneeling down and looking around the assortment of boxes and spare mooring ropes which hid their position. The distinct aroma of tobacco was on the air, and a puff of smoke curled lazily upward against the sky. "There's a guard," Fletch said. He looked skyward at the Temple of the Keeper, a second glowing moon that rose into the night sky, emitting its abnormal light. It had moved farther from shore, but was still a clear beacon in the darkened sky. "Something's not right here," he said, turning to the rest. "We might be able to rush that guard, but if he gets away, he could sound an alarm. Let me go investigate, but be ready for my signal." Fate, Prince Felix, and Edek all nodded silently. Fletch suddenly ducked from cover, and to the amazement of the others, walked briskly down the salted wood planks, directly towards the awaiting sentinel. He held himself with an air of someone who did not have a care in the world, and the loud thump of his feet on the dock was most prominent. He even gave off a low hum of a merry pub tune as he went. Naturally, as he approached the end of the dock, the stout outline of a rabbit separated itself from the shadows and accosted the meandering Fletch.
"What is he doing?"
Fate hissed. Usually she was ready for Fletch's sporadic antics, but the unusual circumstances of tonight had driven him to take chances even she found reckless. Felix opened his mouth, but Fate shushed him quickly. "Evening," Fletch said jovially. His voice was oddly high-pitched and carried back over the quiet water.
"Hold there,"
came a stern voice in reply.
"Who are you, and what you been a-wantin'? The docks here are closed till morning. Best being off back wherever you came from."
"Me?" Fletch said casually. "I'm out taking the air, friend. Seaside strolls set the humors before bed. And wouldn't you know, just as I'm turning my favorite haunt, I just happened to notice the aroma of your pipe. As a connoisseur myself, I was wondering if I could have a fill. My pouch ran empty earlier tonight."
Came the voice again, not entirely convinced. "Be that as it may, the docks are shut to you and any others until first light, so be off with you."
Now, there's no need to be so hasty," Fletch said defensively. "It was an honest request, but I can respect not wanting to part with a good blend." Fate squinted into the night, trying to make out the two figures at the end of the dock, but the darkness was giving her eyes falsehoods. She had always been enamored with Fletch's incredible nighttime vision, an advantage of his blood and vertical pupils. She turned to ask Edek if he could describe what was happening. He also had excellent vision, but instead, her heart plummeted. The Drake was not crouched with them anymore.
"Where is Edek?"
Fate whispered desperately. Felix's eyes grew large as he realized that the Drake was not amongst them, and he shook his head quickly. Fate cursed the overgrown lizard. Wherever he had gotten to, and whatever he was doing, she was sure of one thing, that he was up to no good. Fate stuck her head out from the corner of their hiding spot, looking all around for the Drake. A shadow seemed to move upon the dock, little more than a creeping shuffle low against the wood. Despite his large size, in the dark and to the untrained eye, the unlooked-for Edek creeping along on his belly might have passed for a discarded bit of paraphernalia commonly seen upon the docks. Fate could only gape as the shadowy Edek shuffled ever closer to Fletch and the dock guard. "I feel we got off on the wrong foot," Fletch was attempting to appeal to the guard's better nature. "What's your name, friend?"
"Willem,"
grunted the rabbit. So, Willem, what do you make of all the commotion in the city tonight?" Fletch asked, directing his attention away so their backs were turned towards Fate. Fate saw the silhouette of the stout rabbit squint towards the north.
"Don't rightly know. Some sort of celebration, I assume. All the lights make my head spin."
Fate nearly laughed. A night guard with eyesight even worse than her own. There was a certain irony in that, but Fate's good mood dissipated as she saw Edek's form scuttle forward. The Drake was a bit too rash, trying to take advantage of Fletch's obvious diversion. However bad the guard's eyesight might have been, he would have needed to be deaf too not to notice the twisting squeal let loose from a rotten plank as Edek's considerable weight passed over it. In an instant, the guard had whirled around and set himself against Fletch.
"Who goes there?"
Willem shouted to the knight. He now looked suspiciously at Fletch, all his previous wariness back in place.
"Listen here. I don't like the look of you, old Tom. Be gone or be prodded, skulker."
The glint of a weapon flashed in the twinkling darkness. Fletch froze, both of his paws raised in a non-threatening manner. "Hey, easy where you point that thing." And yet the fox gave off a small chuckle. "I can see there's no fooling you, my good fellow," he said. "I'd say I was alone, but I've told you enough lies for one night. Edek, come say hello to our friend, would you?" Edek's massive form swelled up from the shadows and grew large and menacing as a specter. To the guard's credit, he did not immediately run, but gaped horrified at the shadow creature seemingly summoned from the very void at a word. His trembling paws extended out what looked to be a billhook pike towards the advancing Drake. Edek moved right up to the trembling rabbit and loomed an easy 2 feet above the squat guard.
"Move,"
barked the Drake, and with a simple swat of his massive paw, sent the guard, billhook and all, over the side of the pier. The guard Willem let out the most ungainly scream as he plummeted into the dark water below, his loud yell cut abruptly off by a loud splash. Fate and Prince Felix broke from cover and ran down the dock to join the other two. As Fate approached the breeze skimmer, she noticed gold lettering on the back of the vessel, naming it the Sky Darter. She looked up at the impressive display, temporarily amazed at the craftsmanship of the vessel. Aside from the unique ballast that hung overhead, she noticed a handsome hull of well-crafted and formed wood beams, laid out not unlike a regular seafaring ship. The one unusual exception were the 4 strange mechanisms that alighted each side of the hull. They looked to be made of a thin metal and reminded her of insect wings. She had never been this close to a sky vessel before, but she suspected those contraptions were what allowed the thing to fly. Fate noticed she was gaping and came back to her senses.
"Was that necessary?"
Fate scolded Edek. She looked over the side of the pier. She could see nothing in the dark, but from far below came the sounds of splashing as the stout rabbit stroked his way back towards the bank. Edek merely cocked his head at Fate. She could have sworn she caught a twisted grin, and if she didn't know any better, she would have said the Drake pranced onto the deck of the Sky Darter. "Get aboard, Felix, or we'll cast off without you. This was your harebrained idea, so step lively," Fletch barked. Prince Felix followed quickly behind the Drake and made directly for the controls. Fate looked helplessly at Fletch. "What?" Fletch said defensively as he uncoiled the mooring lines from the dock. "I've never been much of a thespian." Fate sighed heavily and boarded the breeze skimmer, feeling none too happy about the situation. Fletch undid the remaining mooring lines and gave the vessel a huge push away from the dock. The ballast above moved strangely, but the ship below glided through the water smoothly. Fletch tossed the last of the ropes onto the deck of the Sky Darter and then leapt aboard himself. Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.